Virgin Most Powerful, pray for us.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Well now, hi everybody. Yes, greetings. It is time for Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. I am Gary Michuta, and we're here to spend an hour in sharing, explaining, and clarifying the faith with all the might that God gives us. Let's put it that way. It's good to be with you today. I have a great show in store for you. The fellow who started the modern Catholic apologetics movement is coming into the dojo. We're talking with Mr. Carl Keating, who's a founder of Catholic Answers and wrote a seminal book. It actually is the book that got me interested in apologetics, called Catholicism Fundamentalism. We've had Carl on the show a few times and had some really great conversations. And one thing that both he and I like is the old-time apologetics, digging into some books. And there are some really great classical apologetics works out there that's available that people just don't know about. So Carl's coming on the show, and God willing, we'll be able to do this maybe once a month and talk about some of those books that everyone who wants to defend the faith ought to know and read. And today's book is going to be a written controversy between Sir Arnold Lunn and Father Ronald Knox called Difficulty. So that's going to be a ton of fun. I look forward to talking to Carl about this book. It's been on my wish list for quite a while. It's incredibly hard to get a hold of, folks. So if you have a copy, treasure it. And like I said, it's great work. I love Arnold Lunn. I love Father Ronald Knox. So we're going to learn about both and learn about this book and why, if you can get the book or read excerpts from it, please try it. All right, so also we're going to have our usual Finding the Fallacy. Today's fallacy, by the way, is called the Ipse Dixit fallacy. And the Meet the Early Church Father today is actually part 2 of the one we addressed yesterday, who is Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch. He's just too big and too powerful of an apologetic witness for the faith to give only one part. So we're going to do a two-parter. It's a twofer. And this time we're going to dive into some excerpts from his writings. And like I mentioned last time, if you're looking for some Lenten reading, read the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. He wrote 7 letters. Great reading. And as always, you're part of the show. So give us a call, especially when Carl's on board, and maybe have an interesting discussion with Carl at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. Or you can always send your questions or comments or just share your circumstances with us. Just email the dojo at questions@handsonapologetics.com. Questions@handsonapologetics.com. By the way, Hands On Apologetics is my own website. And on it is not only all my books and CDs, but also information on the show, list of former programs, lots of great stuff. Check it out, handsonapologetics.com. And it's time for our shout-outs for those watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. Yes, the emojis are flying on YouTube, folks. It's great to see familiar names there, and welcome to the show. And yes, I did see the emojis even before that. At the corner of my eye, I caught all the colorful stuff. So great to see you, and thank you so much for listening to the program, those listening on radio across the United States and around the world. So why don't we jump into our critical thinking phase and kind of sharpen our intellects to spot fuzzy or bad thinking. And that is our Finding the Fallacy segment. In this segment, like I said, our fallacy for today is the ipse dixit, which is Latin for he said it himself. Okay, so it's basically an assertion without proof. Okay, a dogmatic expression of opinion. So this fallacy basically depends upon the person's own personality to assert that such is so. Okay, you don't need the evidence. Don't ignore the man behind the curtain. Just take my word for it. It's funny. Ipse dixit. If you want to think of an example, probably parents, I think, commit this fallacy more often than not, and that is, whenever the kids want to do something, you say no, and of course the question is why? Why can't I do it? Because I say so. Okay. That is the finding the fallacy, the ipse dixit. Basically, it's a bald assertion, nothing more. And of course, the problem with that is it may serve you as a parent with young kids. It gets tiring giving all the information and reasons why something should or shouldn't be done. But when you're in a debate or discussing something, especially something as important as the faith, ipse dixit is not the way to go. In fact, if someone tries to use it, say, that's fine, I understand that's your position. But once again, where's the evidence? Or, if you remember the old Wendy's commercial, where's the beef? Right? All right. So that's our finding of the fallacy for today, the ipse dixit, which, by the way, means he said it himself. My own word. Now, let's jump to the Meet the Early Church Father for today. Like I said, our early church father is a very important one, especially in the Catholic apologetics. It's Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch is a very early church father. He's considered one of the apostolic fathers. He personally knew the Apostle John, probably also the Apostle Peter, and he was the second bishop of Antioch. And if you recall, Antioch is the city where we were first called Christians. So it's a very ancient, very venerable city. And while he was very old, he was convicted of atheism by the pagan Romans because he refused to worship the pagan gods, and therefore was sent to Rome to be executed by being torn apart by wild beasts. On his way to Rome, he wrote 7 letters, 6 of whom go to individual churches, where he encourages the churches stand true to the faith, and also a personal letter to Polycarp of Smyrna, who is also a disciple of St. John. And all 7 letters, by the way, are available, and you can read them for free on the internet. They're out there. And it's loaded with stuff. Now, he wrote about AD 110, somewhere around there, and he makes certain things very explicit about what was going on in the early church. And so let me give you some quotes. Okay, here's a couple excerpts from his letter to the Ephesians, to the church at Ephesus in Asia, which is worthy of all felicitation, blessed as it is greatness, is the fullness of God the Father, predestined from eternity for glory that is lasting and unchanging, united and chosen through the true suffering by the will of the Father in Jesus Christ our God. Abundant greeting in Jesus Christ and in blameless joy. Did you notice that? He called Jesus Christ our God. So, and he does so in a number of places in these letters where he's very explicit about Christ's divinity. For example, in the same letter, he says there's one physician who is both flesh and spirit, born and not born, who is God in man, true life in death, both from Mary and from God, first able to suffer, then unable to suffer, Jesus Christ our Lord. Likewise, in chapter 18, he says, for our God, Jesus Christ, was conceived by Mary in accord with God's plan of the seed of David, it is true, but also of the Holy Spirit. He was born and was baptized so that by his submission he might purify the water. The virginity of Mary, her giving birth, and also the death of the Lord, was hidden from the prince of the world. 3 mysteries loudly proclaimed, but wrought in the silence of God. So again, you have the affirmation that Christ is God. You also have a reference to the virgin birth, and actually an veiled one. He says the virginity of Mary, her giving birth, and also the death of Christ. So there's something more about her virginity that's a mystery that he points out. In his letter to the Church of Rome, where he was going to be martyred, he begs the people not to save him, to allow him to be martyred for Christ. And in this letter, he says this is in chapter 4, he says, "Not as Peter and Paul do I command you. They were apostles, I'm a convict. They were free, and even to the present time I am a slave. Yet if I suffer, I shall be a freedman of Jesus Christ, and in him I will rise up free. Now in chains I am learning to have no desires of my own." Here is a very early reference to the fact that Saints Peter and Paul were in Rome and exercising some authority in Rome. Now remember, this is 110 AD. Incredibly early reference, okay? Because Ignatius of Antioch still had the preaching of the apostles ringing in his ears, so to speak. Okay, probably the most famous thing that is known from Ignatius of Antioch is his reference to Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. And he does this a number of times in his letters, but I think the most famous and the most quoted by Apologist is in his letter to Smyrna, chapter 7. And he says this: "They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer, because they do not confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, flesh which suffered for our sins, and which the Father in his goodness raised up again. They who deny the gift of God are perishing in their disputes. It would be better for them to have love, so that they might rise again. It is right to shun such men, and not even speak about them, neither in public or in private." Again, very, very powerful passage about the Eucharist by Ignatius of Antioch, who is our Meet the Early Father for today. Coming up on the other side of the break, we are going to dive into the classics with none other than Carl Keating. So stay tuned, and we're going to be talking about Lunn versus Knox. Difficult.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. You know, there's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, "I want my husband to be on fire for the faith." Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. And, I'm always asked, recommend books because in apologetics, when you're defending the faith, it's good to have some great resources on your bookshelf to grab at a moment's notice, or at least on your disk drive. And so we have back Carl Keating, who is going to help us work through some of the absolute most important, most seminal works that I think every Catholic apologist ought to read or be familiar with. Carl Keating, by the way, if you don't know who he is, drop what you're doing right now, go to a computer, and type in www.carlkeating.com. Carl Keating's been really one of the first movers and shakers at kickstarting the modern Catholic apologetics movement in America. He has a number of great books, some of which we've talked on the show about, like the Debating Catholicism series, Booked for Life, Jeremiah's Lament, the Francis Feud, Day by Day with Dr. Johnson. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Catholicism, Fundamentalism. And also, I should probably mention a book that has excerpts from the book that we're going to discuss today, and that's Carl's book, Controversies, High-Level Catholic Apologetics. So welcome to the show, Carl Keating.
Oh, thanks, Gary. It's great to be back with you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. I take it you went hiking recently?
Well, yes, and as soon as we hang up, I'm going to go hiking again. I'm trying to get in some shape for some long hikes later in the summer. And
nice.
So I have a lot of preparation to do because I'm not in the shape I ought to be.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, because I know you're a fan of hiking and a whole bunch of other things, too. You used to fly and...
used to fly. Haven't flown for quite some time, yeah.
Yeah, and writing books. That seems to be another hobby that's keeping you very busy.
It is. As a matter of fact, the books I'm working on now happen to be about backpacking. So, you don't have to write about religion all the time.
That's right. And speaking of that, the book that we're going to discuss today, at least one of the authors, maybe I don't know so much about Ronald Knox, but Arnold Lunn wrote several books on all sorts of different topics besides Catholic apologetics.
That's right. Yeah, we're going to be talking about a book that the two did together. It's actually an exchange of correspondence. The book is called Difficulties, and it's one of my probably 3 favorite books. And if I had my way, I would be buried with it in the other 2 books. On the off chance that reports have been mistaken, that we can take a few things with us. But that's an indication of how much I like the book Difficulties. And the biggest difficulty about Difficulties is finding a copy.
Yes.
Because it's been out of print for close to a lifetime.
Yeah.
And there are a few used copies available, but very expensive. So I'm hoping that some good publishers, such as maybe Ignatius Press or another, will have the kindness to bring this book back into print, as they have brought some other Ronald Knox books back into print. Because I think this is maybe the best apologetics book ever written, even though it's not in the format that we normally think of apologetics books as being expository treatises, dealing with particular things. As I said, this is an exchange between 2 very learned and witty men, and I think it's a wonderful book, not just because of what it says about Christianity, but what it says about how argumentation and discussion can be undertaken. All the more important in our days when things have been reduced to internet memes and the like, and people seem to have lost the ability to talk, to think, to listen, and to interact with one another.
Yes, yeah. So why don't you introduce both of the authors? Let's begin with Father Ronald Knox. Can you give us a short sketch of his story?
A little overview of each guy. Now, they were contemporaries. Each was born in 1888. Knox lived until 1957. Lunn until 1974. Interestingly, Knox's literary biographer, the novelist Evelyn Waugh, people might know him best from Brideshead Revisited, mentioned in his biography of Knox that unfortunately Knox died a bit too young at age 69. That had he lived another decade, he would have become a national institution in Britain. Well, as it was, Knox was a remarkable man. We might consider him best to be the 20th century's equivalent to John Henry Newman. Like Newman, he was a convert. Knox's father became the Anglican bishop of Manchester, England. Knox went to Eton Preparatory School in Oxford, excelled at both, arguably, by many people, the most brilliant Etonian and Oxfordian ever, or at least in the 20th century.
Wow.
He became a prolific writer. I think I have all of his books, and they vary. In the 1920s, he was a very popular writer of detective fiction, and it was he who wrote up the so-called Decalogue, or 10 rules for detective writers, that people like Agatha Christie and G.K. Chesterton and other writers of detective stories followed in composing their books. Things to do, things not to do. For example, don't include a Chinaman. Yeah, don't include the surprise conclusion where you give no facts beforehand, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so Knox is very popular there. He's also very well known as the last man that I can think of who single-handedly translated the entire Bible into English. He did it from the Vulgate, that is the official Latin version of the Church, with reference to the Hebrew and Greek. He was so fluent in Greek that when he was in Oxford, he faked having discovered an ancient Greek manuscript that scholars were looking for centuries, and scholars accepted it as being the real thing. That's how good Knox was.
Wow.
You may remember Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds radio show that caused such a scare around 1930 or so. Mm-hmm. Several years before, in 1926, Knox was on the BBC and did something similar about a mob storming Parliament. It was a spoof. It was a satire. It was really funny. But people thought it was real, and they were all worried about it. So he actually gave Orson Welles the idea for that other show. So
really?
Knox is just simply a brilliant man. He became a convert in 1917 at the age of 29, partly influenced by G.K. Chesterton, who was not yet then a Catholic. Chesterton became a Catholic later in 1922, and he was influenced by Knox. So there was a back and forth thing. Knox's magnum opus came out in 1950. It's called Enthusiasm. It was a look at what's called Illuminism, or the kind of emotionalism within Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, but mainly Catholic, and how that has led to errors over the centuries, especially since the 17th century onward. Those are the times he was looking at. So Knox wrote all kinds of things. He was a chaplain for Catholic students at Oxford for many years. He wrote apologetical books for young people, especially schoolgirls, and he wrote those, for example, in the 1940s. So a wide variety of talents, truly an amazing man.
Yeah, what was before we move on, what was what caused him to convert to Catholicism?
Wide reading, and he mentions this in his spiritual autobiography called A Spiritual Aeneid. The Aeneid being the title of Virgil's story about what happened after the fall of Troy and how Rome was established. So Knox has explained how he came to Rome, how he crossed the Tiber, so to speak. It was something that was difficult for him because his father, who became later the Anglican bishop, was so upset that he wrote Knox out of his will. So there were personal problems that came from that. Yeah. But Knox basically was convinced by the consistency of Catholic teaching, and by, as Newman was, by the fact that if you trace the Catholic Church back, it goes back all the way to the first century, and you can't say that about any other church. So
Yeah.
he was a man of wide talents, brilliant linguist, a true wit, not a humorist, but a wit, a man of great compassion. I love reading his books. He and Lunn were of the school of great courtesy in the writing. In fact, Knox himself often would talk about our Lord's relations with us and how God has been courteous to mankind. And courteous is a word that Knox used a lot about God's relationship to us, but it was also a word that fit Knox very well.
Yeah, was he, I'm just going to throw this out, but when I read Lunn, and he recounts it several times about his encounters with Father Knox, it seems to me that Father Knox was not very warm and chummy with him. Is that
well, you have to understand the beginning was a little bit cool because Lunn instigated the relationship between them by writing a book called Roman Converts. This was in 1925, where he looked at half a dozen men who had converted to the Catholic Church. And they included not just Newman, but Henry Manning, who became a British cardinal, George Terrell, who became a modernist priest, Chesterton, and Knox. And he wasn't completely complimentary about Knox. At that point, Lunn himself was something of an agnostic.
Yes.
And so Difficulties is a book of letters that were exchanged between the two of them in 1930 and 1931. And the book came out originally in 1932. The edition I have is 1950, when it was reprinted with two subsequent letters from them that were written in 1949 and 1950, where they looked back on their earlier correspondence. But basically, what Knox said in Difficulties about Lunn was that when the book Roman Converts came out and was rather uncomplimentary about Knox, Knox thought of writing a reply to Lunn, and he said he never sent it, but he said it was going to be something of a snorter. And he said he was glad he didn't send it off. He said it was one of the few cases in his life where doing the right thing had the right consequences. Because the two men ended up having this exchange in Difficulties.
Yeah.
And then when that book came out in 1932, 2 years later, Knox brought Lunn into the church.
Yeah.
And then after that, after 1934, Lunn himself became a prominent Catholic apologist. And so I think maybe it's time we should go and talk about Arnold Lunn a bit.
Yes. Well, we're coming up on our break. I hear the music coming up. So, yeah, we'll talk about Arnold Lunn on the other side of the break. We're talking with Carl Keating about books that every Catholic apologist ought to read, and even if you're not a Catholic apologist, I recommend it. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about the book Difficulties.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. You know, there's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Talking with Carl Keating. And Carl, I feel like we're ringside and introducing a fight. And in the Catholic corner, we just talked about Father Ronald Knox. Why don't we talk about the other corner, Sir Arnold Lunn?
Let's do that. Now, Arnold Lunn was a very interesting man. If he's known at all today, he's known quite differently to two different constituencies. Yeah. You and I know him best as a Catholic apologist. In his later years, after his conversion in 1934, Lunn was, in a more formal sense than Knox even, truly a Catholic apologist. He ended up having a number of literary exchanges, that is, exchanges of letters, with non-Catholics, and they're wonderful books to read. You get both sides of the story. Lunn's a great Catholic evangelist and apologist in those works. He often lectured and so on. He was very effective. So we know him as an apologist. But there's a whole other group of people who don't realize that part of his life, but they knew him as a mountaineer and a skier. And he became famous in that. Now, Lunn, as I said, was born the same year as Knox, 1888. His father, Sir Henry Lunn, was a Methodist minister. And remember, Knox's father ultimately was an Anglican bishop. And Knox's father later founded Lunn's travel agency, which was the first organization to open up Switzerland as a very popular resort area for skiing and other things. So Switzerland became popular with the British because of Lunn's father. And by the way, one of Lunn's brother, Hugh Kingsmill Lunn, under the name of Hugh Kingsmill, became a very popular journalist and novelist in England. So Lunn comes from this family, but he says, by the way, and this is at the very end of the book Difficulties, he went to Harrow preparatory school as Knox had gone to Eton. And he said here, I lost my faith while still at Harrow, largely as a result of reading a cheap reprint of a book by a very great mountaineer, Leslie Stephen. And the title of the book was An Agnostic's Apology. And he said, I did not resume the practice of religion until I asked you, that is Knox, to receive me into the church. So Lunn early on became very interested in mountaineering and in skiing in particular. In fact, he became so adept at it and so well known that it was he who invented the slalom ski race that's used in the Olympics, even to today. And he wrote many books, about half of them about mountaineering and skiing, the other half about religion. Really a compartmentalized life, so to speak. There's no one book of his that deals with both subjects at any length. Yeah. And many of the books about mountaineering have to do with the mountains of Switzerland in particular. So, a very interesting man. There's still available online at YouTube an interview that he had on William F. Buckley's Firing Line program a few years before Lunn died. Yeah. And it's worth looking up to get a sense of the man. So anyway, he's an agnostic, but he moves towards, in the 1920s, he's moving towards an appreciation of Christianity, an interest in Christianity, but still a skepticism. And all through his life, Lunn was a skeptic in basically a good sense. He wanted proofs of things. He wouldn't take something just on somebody's say-so. He wanted to think things through and to get proof. and that ultimately led him into the church.
Yeah.
So, as I said, in 1925, he wrote Roman Converts, where he took to task Knox and other people. And eventually, by 1930, the two of them are exchanging correspondence. And that correspondence ultimately leads to Lunn coming into the Catholic Church.
Did he ever enter into the Anglican Church, or was it straight to the Catholic Church?
I think it was straight to, because he said here, I'll read it again, I did not resume the practice of religion until I asked you to receive me into the church. So he might have been, in some very nominal sense, an Anglican. His father, as I said, had been Methodist.
Yes.
But he didn't actually practice Christianity until Knox brought him into the Catholic Church. But he was keenly interested in Christianity, and even defended Catholicism in books that he wrote as correspondence with other non-Catholics prior to this book with Knox.
Yes.
So already he had been writing with others, and defending the general Christian position and even elements of Catholic distinctives and Catholic history when dealing with agnostics or non-believers of other sorts. So
yes.
He was a fellow traveler for a good number of years. And the very fact that he wrote Roman Converts and took to task people like Chesterton and Newman and so on, really that was an indication of his attraction to the church, and yet he couldn't cross the Tiber himself. And so he was finding enough excuses not to. And so it's a very interesting book on its own. But by the time he and Knox, 5 years later, in 1930, begin corresponding, Knox isn't that far away from the faith, but he's got enough concerns that in the opening of the book, his very first letter starts this way. He said, to Dear Knox, that's the way they would refer to him, Dear Knox, Dear Lunn, always just with the last name. He said, the a priori case for the Roman Catholic Church has always seemed to me quite plausible. It is reasonable to suppose that Christ would not have left the world without some institution appointed to preserve his teaching from corruption. And clearly, the claims of the Roman Catholic Church to be the institution in question are very strong. And he mentions the Church's history and so on. He says, all that given, but there are problems. Okay, and so he goes on from there. Well, those problems end up getting resolved ultimately, partly through the very exchange with Knox.
How did the exchange come about? Did Lunn challenge Knox to a written debate?
Yes, because both of them were very good debaters. Both had headed the union at Oxford, that is the debating society at Oxford. Lunn, although they used the same age as Knox, was a year behind at Oxford. He started later. And so both were very well known at Oxford as debaters, and they knew each other there to some extent, but because they were a year apart in studying different subjects, I suppose, they weren't particular friends at Oxford. So that, their true friendship came much later. But Lunn was a bit of a provocateur.
Yes.
And so he proposed the situation to Knox, and he says, Father Knox has accepted battle on the ground of my choosing. I'm grateful to him for a correspondence which has interested me far more than the games of correspondence chess that I used to play in bygone days. I awaited his letters with far greater eagerness than the moves of my chess correspondence. My efforts to entangle him in a mating net have failed. The Roman bishop has not yet been forked by the Protestant knight, and the game, which remains unfinished at the call of time, must therefore be submitted to the adjudication of the reader. So it was Lunn who challenged Knox. Knox took up the challenge, and the ultimate result was one that probably Knox didn't expect, but certainly Lunn didn't, which was that in just 2 years, Lunn would become a Catholic.
Yeah, absolutely. But, to Arnold Lunn's credit, and you kind of alluded to this, he was pursuing the truth, no matter where it led. But he was going to do it critically and reasonably. And that was, I know through his autobiographies, that was one of the reasons why he left this kind of atheism, because they were refusing to investigate things like, telepathy and things like that, paranormal things, because they just said, well, that's all poppycock. But he felt that we're free thinkers. We should be investigating everything, So
one of his later books was called, it's a thin book called The Third Day, and it's about the resurrection. And he's looking at it scientifically, historically. And he says, well, what evidence do we have? And one of his arguments is that, we have more evidence for this, certainly more evidence for Jesus Christ in general, than we do for any person of antiquity. We say we know a lot about Caesar and Aristotle and many of these people, but for none of them do we have as much information as we do about Jesus and about those who were his first followers and who testified to his resurrection. So Lunn makes a very good argument in a thin book called The Third Day for the historicity of the resurrection. So he's trying to do this scientifically, very logically, very academic, not so much academically in a stuffy sense, but he's trying to work through logically all these things. And of course, by this time, when he wrote The Third Day, he was already, strong believer. But he is coming at it in a way that is especially endearing to those who like to think things through. That was one of his great virtues. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, he he styled himself as a rationalist, and to his shock, he found out that the medieval period were the real rationalists, the medieval doctors. That's right. I mean, you look at something, for example, like Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologiae, and very few Catholics ever turn to it. It's a book actually written for beginners, as St. Thomas said. It's simply written. It doesn't have difficult terms. It's very long, but it's not a hard book to understand. But it's extremely logical, because he starts from basically point one, does anything exist, and goes on from there. And he builds up the case for Christianity, Catholicism, of course, which is what Christianity was at that point. There wasn't anything else. And so the schoolmen, as they were called in the Middle Ages, the scholastic scholars and writers, people like Aquinas and so many others, were very logical. And, the writings could be dry in a way, but the nice thing about Lunn is that he's just as logical as they were, but his writings are never dry. He's very engaging. And he has such a rapport with those with whom he has these exchanges. I think he wrote 4 or 5 books now that were exchanges of letters. And they range from the early 1930s to 1946 was the last one. And in each case, the level of courtesy with his opponent was remarkable. You just don't see anything comparable to it today. Yes. Very good. Wonderful man all the way around. Excellent. Well, we're talking with Carl Keating about the book Difficulties, Arnold Lunn versus Father Ronald Knox. When we come back on the other side of break, let's see if we can look at some of the highlights of the book. Stay tuned.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet 3 men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Michuta. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We're talking with the one, the only Carl Keating about a book I think every Catholic apologist ought to read. It's a controversy, an exchange of letters between Sir Arnold Lunn and Father Ronald Knox called Difficulties. And we gave the introductions to the two corners. And, Carl, why don't we, maybe you can score the debate for us a little bit. What were the big punches and the highlights of this exchange?
A lot of the exchange in the book Difficulties concerned historical matters. Okay. Because these, at that time, the first third of the 20th century, were the chief modes of attack by Protestants against Catholics. What about Galileo? What about the Inquisition? All these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so the first good chunk of the book, for example, has to do with the Inquisition and how to understand it. Matter of fact, there were a number of different Inquisitions. For example, the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, and so on. The Inquisition in France. They were quite different things. And the two men sort of worked through that. Finally, they got to the point where Knox said, and I quote this, "I think I'd better confine the issue to this point, lest we should wander interminably in a wilderness of comparative atrocity statistics." How many people did Inquisition kill? For example, I've seen more recent anti-Catholic literature in the last few decades saying, 95 million people died under the Inquisition, which is bigger than the whole population of Europe during those centuries, where in fact it was about 3,000 people altogether. So Knox and Lunn went back and forth about that, and so each one would sort of inquire to the other and correct the other. So by the time you finish their exchange, you not only get a sense of the issue itself, but the relative value of the various other controversialists who wrote about it. There's an American, for example, named H.C. Lee, L-E-A, who was very popular with Protestants because he supposedly had the real scoop on the Inquisition. Turned out he didn't. He misunderstood so much. But this was a guy who was popular at the time that Lunn and Knox wrote. So they talk a lot about him. So the Inquisition was one of the issues. Later on, they talk about the Galileo affair. And is the Catholic Church anti-science and so on. And later on, once he became a Catholic and Lunn revisited the Galileo issue, he pointed out very perceptively that the Galileo case is the only case ever brought up to support the argument that the Catholic Church has been against science. You can't point to anything else. And so that's a pretty slim argument to say the Church is anti-science. And then once you look in the case itself, you can blow that argument away. But Lunn points out, not in this book, but elsewhere, that if the Church were anti-science, you ought to find lots of such instances as Galileo supposedly was. And, of course, you don't. So that's the kind of thing that Knox and Lunn are doing throughout this book. They cover dozens of topics. But many of them, as I say, are historical. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where the Huguenots, the Protestants, the French Protestants were slaughtered at the insistence of the Queen, basically. What did that imply? How do you understand the Bible? How do you accept it? Toward the end of the correspondence, Knox, writing to Lunn, tries to summarize their approach, the mutual approach to thing, and how does a reader of this book look at this? And he says, the grievance which a reader is more likely to express, I mean the one who's more generally sympathetic with your attack, that is Lunn's attack, is that your difficulties were not his difficulties. Your angle of divergence, not his angle. He would have rubbed in the cruelties of the Inquisition rather than its injustices. He would have quarreled less with hell and more with purgatory. He would have criticized the general spirit of the Catholic attitude to Scripture instead of isolating a point here and there and so on. So those are the kinds of things, that they discussed. Hell, purgatory, do they exist? What do they mean? Scripture, how do we understand it? Where did it come from? How does it get interpreted? All the kinds of things that you might want to have discussed are discussed in this book.
Yeah.
But Knox here, and Lunn really agrees with him, it says, we emphasize different things because we see things through different spectacles. Lunn at this point is still writing with basically Protestant spectacles. And Knox, of course, already has been a Catholic for 13 years before the correspondence even begins. And so he's looking through Catholic spectacles. And so they approach things differently. The whole idea of the sense of mystery. What is a mystery when you are talking about the Eucharist? How to understand that? Lunn isn't unsympathetic, but he's still at this point so much a rationalist that he's having trouble accepting that something like the mystery of the Eucharist can occur. Okay? Right. Later on, he comes to endorse it wholeheartedly. But the book, Difficulties, covers dozens of topics. And the discussion back and forth is to my mind, is done so winningly that even when you don't agree, say, with Lunn, you admire the argument.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Does Lunn make any progress during the debate? Are there points where he kind of concedes and moves on, or is it pretty much they end up the same place where they started?
There are lots of mutual concessions throughout the book, because one will bring up maybe an historical angle on something, and the other say, okay, I see your point, we'll move on. So there's a lot of that. I think you get a flavor by the end of the book that Lunn is beginning to modify his overall sense of Catholicism. He's more open to it. He's beginning to see some light in areas where he saw only shadows. He's not too explicit about that, though, and that comes later. He ends up writing 3 or 4 memoirs about his conversion in the later books. Yes. Now I See was the first one, which came out, I think in 1933 or so. But already, even in Difficulties, you can see a bit of a change in Lunn. In Knox, you don't, because he's already firm in the Catholic faith, and maybe he's polishing his technique in dealing with such an intelligent antagonist as Lunn. Mm-hmm. But in this book, you don't see a wholesale change in either man, but you do sense some movement or increasing depth of appreciation in Lunn.
Yes. Yeah. Carol, I tried to look this up before the show, but Lunn wrote so many memoirs about his life, I couldn't locate it. Yeah. So I'll just quote from memory that he shares an instance after Difficulties was printed with a friend, and he brings up a point, and he says, well, see, obviously Knox is begging the question. And to his chagrin, his friend responds, yes, but he does so persuasively.
Yes. The style of writing by both men in this book, and in their later books too, is so, I want to say elevated, but that gives the impression of being hoity-toity, and it's not at all that. Right. It's so profound, it's so subtle and profound, and yet very popular in its style. Yes, even if Knox may have been begging a particular question, he was so persuasive about it. But Lunn in his own way too later on, especially when a Catholic. Now they very seldom had to beg any questions. But these are two masters of the apologetical craft that every Catholic ought to read. If you can't get a copy of Difficulties, get copies of whatever else you can find by them.
Yes.
Because these are wonderful writers, and read their other stuff, because eventually some kind publisher will bring Difficulties back into print, and will do a public service by doing that, and then you'll be prepped and primed, to read this book. And I think you too, listener, may decide it's one of your 3 favorite books that you want to be buried with.
Yes, or you could pick up a copy of Carl's book, Controversies, High-Level Apologetics, because I believe you have a chapter of an excerpt from that book. And
yes,
also some other
and
ones.
in my memoir, Book for Life, I talk about the book at some length.
Yeah. You will not be bored. I can guarantee that. It's very fun to watch them jab at each other, and like you said, very charitably, but nevertheless, they are jabs and punches. But they're so well done. In one of his other books, I think it was against C.E.M. Joad, who was an agnostic at the time, where they're trying to prove that Lunn is basically trying to argue the basics of Christianity to Joad. And he said they actually got on along pretty well. He said, when I first visited you at your home, I was impressed to see the paintings you had on the wall. And how can I feel badly toward a man who likes the paintings of Van Dyck? Okay, so that's the way, Lunn would approach this. Very, very, as I say, courteous, witty, yes.
Urbane, and Lunn and Knox were just so knowledgeable about so many things beyond religion. They can work all this stuff in, and it's just a feast for the mind, all of their works, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Well, Carl, I can't believe the hour has flown. How can people get a hold of some of your own gems?
Well, they can go, of course, to my website, carlkeating.com, and learn about some of them, or can find all of them at Amazon. Just search on my name at Amazon, and you'll find it. Among my most recent books are Debating Catholicism, a series of 4 books, and The Francis Feud, Why and How Conservative Catholics Squabble About Pope Francis. But you can find all my stuff at either Amazon or leads to most of it at carlkeating.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me, Gary. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. And that's Carl Keating. Wow. I highly recommend any books by Ronald Knox, especially Arnold Lunn. He's one of my favorite authors. Get it if you can, especially Difficulties. That is a difficulty to get a hold of. Well, coming up tomorrow, Ken Hensley comes back into the dojo, and he's going to talk about belief in God and human worth, how atheism ultimately undermines human value, human integrity. Also, Joseph Smith and Father Patrick Collins is going to come into dojo Thursday and Friday, Coming up next, we have the dynamic duo of Talk Radio, the Terry and Jesse Show. Don't want to miss that, folks. And it's hard to believe, but our hour just flies because it's just so much great information. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here in Michigan, turn off the dojo lights, at least temporarily, and wish everybody a very blessed, holy day. And stay tuned for the Terry and Jesse Show coming up next on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, You can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, so I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life.